chapter 1, I don't think, is intending to teach us that God made the world in 6 consecutive 24-hour days. For those who hold to the doctrine of original sin, that is to say, that we are culpable for Adam's sin, I myself don't hold to that classical doctrine of original sin.
Let's take this a reductio ad absurdum. So let's take it to the absurd level. Well, I'm a Christian, and I now believe that the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, was entirely false. It's just basically, it's all historically wrong. You get this tension with people trying to prove things like the flood naturalistically and going to all these lengths, but then if you believe that God is omnipotent, then God can just do everything by miracle. So then you get this situation like, if God has done it by miracle, he appears to have swept all the evidence away. So it's like, here's a miracle, it's happened. Like, you can't use natural science to explain this. Look, blah. To us, like using the scientific method, it looks like it never happened. It's theologically nonsense, it's philosophically nonsense. We've got no evidence for it happening, and we've got a load of evidence against it. So if it's all wrong, for the sake of argument, how could I justify my religion? I don't know. I don't know how I could. I would have to really jump through hoops as a Christian to completely throw out the Old Testament and maintain a Christianity.
Welcome back to the Gnostic Informant, and you are about to attain true gnosis. And I'm back after a week of being sick, feeling better now, and joining me for who knows how many times now, just a regular on the show, Jonathan MS Pearce, a tippling philosopher. Go and subscribe right now. His channel's getting bigger and bigger. Be a part of it. It is a truth haven.
Thank you. Yes, no, it is growing, and I'm pretty excited about that and putting out a load more content. But I am just a regular Joe on a regular show. So no, I thank you for inviting me back, dude.
Yeah, man. And today we have some juicy topics. And so you and I were discussing in the realm of Christendom, there's a debate going on. And it's a pretty serious debate. And does the Old Testament have to be literally true for Christianity to be true?
So
go ahead.
Yeah, well, no, it's such a cool question. This is such an important question, and it's not just. It's something I've been thinking about for a long time, because I wrote the book The Nativity, a critical examination, and then I wrote The Resurrection, a critical examination. And those two books are looking at the historical basis of the Jesus story. And I'm now writing a third part of that trilogy, which is looking at the Exodus. And the question that struck me right at the beginning, because the whole point of it, of those two books, is to say, right, if there's no historical basis for the Jesus story, then where does that leave the Christian? But then to take it a step further back and say, okay, if the Exodus didn't happen and the Moses story is largely mythological or entirely mythological, then where does that leave the Christian? Because at the end of the day, you've got Jesus coming along and saying, I'm here to fulfill every jot and tittle of the law. Well, if you're showing that the Mosaic law, for example, isn't based in historical reality, then what is this saying? And if Christianity is an edifice, a building built on the foundations of the Hebrew Bible, and we can say that the Hebrew Bible is largely, to a huge degree, ahistorical, as in mythological, then where does that leave Christianity? So I think it's a really important question, and we'll talk a little bit later about how that's come into the public eye again recently.
Right. Yeah. And so William Lane Criag was on a podcast, and they were talking about Adam and Eve. And William Lane Criag, who is a professional debater, who he has debates with people like Dr. Krauss and scientists and real smart people, and he tries to keep face by being scientific and being in the realm of scientific method.
Mythohistory is a term that was coined by the eminent Assyriologist Thorkild Jakobsen to describe a piece of literature that is historical in intent. It intends to relate events concerning people that actually lived and wrought, but it does so in the figurative and metaphorical language of myth, and therefore is not to be interpreted with a sort of wooden literality. Chapter 1, I don't think, is intending to teach us that God made the world in 6 consecutive 24-hour days. But what it is intending to teach us is that God is the transcendent creator of the universe. For those who hold to the doctrine of original sin, that is to say, that we are culpable for Adam's sin, or that Adam's sin corrupted human nature and we all bear that disease. Now, I myself don't hold to that classical doctrine of original sin. I think that that is neither taught in Genesis 3 nor in Romans 5. I think what Paul teaches is that Adam was the floodgate through which sin entered into the human race, and then sin spread to all men because, as Paul says, all men sin.
So he tries to have his cake and eat it too by saying, well, if the Big Bang is true and evolution is true, the Bible could still be true. And he tries to make a claim that because it's mytho-history, Adam and Eve, and may not necessarily be real. And he even said, who do you think was there with a pen and paper watching Adam and Eve doing it? You think that's not plausible? Like he became a skeptic for a second. I'm like, oh damn, my man's got it in him. And but he pissed off a lot of people by saying that.
Because I mean, his whole career has been trying to be all things to all people in the Christian world, and he's been really successful at that, because when you look, and he's had a very long and successful debating career. I mean, he's highly revered. He's got an exceptionally good memory and working memory as well, that he can recall facts and people and quotes and things when he's in debate. So he's a formidable debater, rhetorically speaking. But because he's been so successful, Christians of all types have gone, this is our guy. He's winning our battles for us against these nasty atheists and skeptics. So they have taken on board all of his arguments, and that then puts him in a bind, because he then is beholden to his audience and people who are buying his books and signing up to X, Y, and Z that he does, because he's got a huge kind of financial organization around him, reasonable faith and all these sort of things he does. So when he used to be challenged in debate on the Old Testament, people usually in the Q&A, you would get some skeptic standing up and saying, what do you say about this? He would kind of defer to Paul Copan and hold up Paul Copan's book, Is God a Moral Monster? And then that's the end of that. And he would not really get involved in debates about the historical truth of all problems of the Old Testament, because he knew that if he did that, he would have to be honest with himself. This is me supposing this. He would have to be honest with himself and say, actually, there are issues with the historical veracity of everything in the Old Testament. So we've got to be careful, and there is obviously myth and this and that in there. And so that would then he would isolate himself from a lot of his base and a lot of the people who support him, a lot of the evangelical community. So he steered away from that. I mean, he's worked for the Biologos Institute, which is, does take on science. It is your more it was more liberal, or at least more.
They hide behind deist arguments, because deism came out of rationality, came out of the Enlightenment, because the people like who are deists, for example, are looking at religion and they're saying, okay, we now know this because of science. We now know this because we now know this about the world. All these things we now know, so we have to rethink what we think of God itself. So now deist arguments are very strong. You can't necessarily disprove a deist argument as much as you can prove it. You can't prove it either. But they're deists. That's the point of deism, is to try to come up with a theory about a creator who put things in motion, who doesn't necessarily even intervene on things, right? So what happens with people like William Lane Craig is they look at these really strong deist arguments and they hide behind them, but then say therefore Bible, and apply it to their theology, which is I think it's such a cheap thing to do.
There is an idea of going from God in the general to God in a particular, as in the Christian God. So you can use deistic arguments such as the Kalam cosmological argument to argue that there's a creator of the universe, and then argue it has to be a personal creator, and then argue that actually through all these other evidences and whatnot, you get to the Christian God. So there are techniques that someone like Craig would use, and he will use everything obviously in his arsenal, as everyone would.
Right.
And the problem is that for him, he's well, not the problem. I mean, he uses these more fideistic arguments, these kind of faith-based arguments about the witness of the Holy Spirit being the primary reason that he believes, and then moves on to your evidentialist arguments. So looking at the at evidences in the world around, at the resurrection, at the empty tomb, and the historical evidence for Christianity, and puts all these things together and says, here's my huge case for why I believe and why you should believe as well. And so there will be all the types of arguments in there, the evidentialist ones, the more generalistic sort of deistic ones, and then the personal witness of the Holy Spirit ones. And there you go. But if he then starts to renege on some of the kind of literalist claims, as I said, he is going to annoy some of his base, who are your evangelical Christians, who say, well, no, this is a problem. It's all or nothing. In for a penny, in for a pound. It's all got to be true. And if it's all not true, then it starts unraveling and falling apart, which I would argue is actually a fairly sensible thing to say.
There's a reason why. And here's the reason why. The whole entire point of the New Testament is to say that Adam sinned. Now mankind is doomed to hell because of this. And the laws that Moses were given by God are too harsh, and that nobody can follow them. So therefore, you need a savior. So with that being said, if Adam and Eve aren't real people, if they're just myth, the whole thing falls apart, because if Adam never sinned, then why would you need a savior? So therefore, the argument, the liberal argument that, well, Adam and Eve can be a myth, but still, Jesus still died for our sins. What sins? What do you mean? If Adam's not real, then the whole thing's not real.
And this is where you can start seeing the arguments within Christianity about original sin. Is this a problem? Are we born depraved? Within Christianity, there are heaps of arguments, and different theologians will believe different things about, say, original sin and depravity and these kind of things. And you can understand why these arguments come about, because actually, the Bible seems to be telling you something, but if you then say, well, it's not literally, that didn't really happen, then you are faced with some of these really big problems. And I think so it would be useful now to just go through a few of the stories in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew Bible, and show them for what they are. So I mean, the creation one, as you mentioned, is an interesting one. So we've got Adam and Eve, we've got the Garden of Eden, we've got the Tree of Knowledge, which is problematic in itself, right? Because they are told, don't go and eat eat fruit from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. So they don't know good and evil already. So then they go and eat from that, and then they're punished for eating from it, but they don't know the good and evil.
Then they become aware that they're naked all of a sudden.
Yeah.
So it's injected with philosophy. The philosophy of knowledge is sort of sin in itself, because you're no longer in tune with God's nature that he created for you. You're now going your own way, in a sense,
and using your own rationality. There is some interesting theology going on there, but it's nonsensical, because they're being punished for doing something wrong. When they did that thing that was wrong, they hadn't yet eaten from the fruit from the tree, so they wouldn't know what was wrong. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Right.
So the whole premise of the original sin argument is broken.
And I know this is a little bit off course, but just for a quick second, why is the tree even there?
So what you get with a lot of mythological stories, and I would argue this is for Sodom and Gomorrah, this is for Judas hanging himself and the name of the field, for all sorts of different stories. The Tower of Babel, these are etiology, Aetiology, etiology, which is explaining how things come to be. Right. And you can argue that flood myths are these as well. You know, every culture has floods because people live on floodplains because they are fertile by rivers, so you can get water, so people are naturally going to get flooded a lot, right? So then these kind of stories are built. Why do you get floods? They don't understand, you know, the physical geography of the world. So you have stories of explanation. The Tower of Babel. Why do people have different languages all around the world? We don't understand the evolution of the languages. You know, we don't do anthropology, so we create a story like the Tower of Babel to explain that. Sodom and Gomorrah. Why do we have this pillar of there's a salty statue? Is it not salty statue, like a rock formation? And you know, that's explained by the Sodom and Gomorrah story, and also the salt of the Dead Sea. So you get a story that comes along afterwards to explain something that needs explaining for the local culture.
There's also a pillar of salt that looks like a person. It's
like that's what I'm saying. Yeah, that's the pillar. Yeah, that rock.
That's
rock
Lot's
pillar.
wife just chilling.
Yeah.
2021.
Yeah. So these stories are made to explain things that are pre-existing, and they're sort of retrospectively, you know, positioned to before these things to explain them. And in the case of the creation stories, obviously they need to explain creation. So why is there anyone? Why are there people? But also, you know, how do we explain knowledge and morality, and then if we believe in God's, you know, that relationship between us and God. So these stories are just explaining stuff, but they didn't happen. These were explaining things that had already happened. We already were existing. So let's create a myth or a story that explains our existence. So and the problem with the Adam and Eve story is that when you look at the ancient Near East and you go to the Mesopotamian cultures that pre-existed the Canaanite or Israelite, Hebrew cultures, however you want to kind of label them, you have a Garden of Eden, you have a tree of knowledge, you have ribs. So there's a rib goddess. You have talking serpents. Right? These pre-existed the Adam and Eve story. So it's really difficult for the Christian to have some kind of biblical exceptionalism where they go, yeah, but our story is a correct one. Yeah, but there were versions of your story that were different, that existed before your story, that we've got evidence of before your story. Yeah, but no, it didn't draw on that one. Ours is the correct one. Yeah, not too sure about that.
Right. And
so, yeah.
Then you look at the different accounts of like the location of Eden. Some people say some accounts say it's on Earth. Some accounts say it's right near Earth. It's like,
oh yes, so they've basically found it. It's a floodplain between two areas in the Mesopotamian region.
Yeah, and they actually called that place paradise. The Persians actually called that place paradise. But whatever, that's another subject for another day.
Yeah. I mean, but these are sort of things that you bring into bear in showing that a story like the Adam and Eve story is not historically true. You say because you start placing it. You're going to speak to Joshua Bowen soon. He's a really interesting example of a very committed Christian who then started learning about everything, and then started doing Assyriology as a PhD. And as soon as he started learning about the cultures around the sort of Jewish region, the Canaanite, Israelite, Judea, all depending on which time frame you're talking about, outside of those regions, Mesopotamia, Sumeria, Babylonia, as soon as he started learning about those in any great depth, he realized that the Old Testament just couldn't stand up, and he lost his faith just straight away. It literally, so he'd been this super committed, witnessing Christian, really well-educated Greek, knew these other languages, Hebrew, and then as soon as he started looking at the ancient Near East historically and anthropologically, it just pulled the rug out from under his feet, and he lost his faith.
And he's not the only one that has a story like that. Now, a lot of people who are Christians go to school to learn, to get a degree and learn philosophy and theology, and that's what happens. The more they learn, and even myself, Now I didn't go as far as I'm not a scholar like Josh Bowen is. He's extremely brilliant, smart dude, writes books. I'm not that type of person, but I was able to pick up books, read them, learn about history, learn a little bit of Hebrew, tiny bit of Hebrew, and I did the same thing happened to me. It's like that should tell you something. I was going to church twice a week. I was doing this church streaming. I was the streaming guy. That's why I learned all this stuff right here. I was so into it, so sure it was true, and that's and it's like you would think other people would see that and be like, because other Christians who I was around knew that I was the guy that was like going hardcore. I'm reading Josephus. I'm learning a little bit of Hebrew. I had this guy at the church who we would do. I had these cards that with Hebrew on them. And one side would be a word, the other side would be English, and he would help me study. And I was banging them all out, just the basics, right? And like they knew I was learning this shit. And all of a sudden, now I'm gone. So you would think they would be like, "Whoa, the dude who is really looking into this stuff is gone now." But no,
I mean, there's always been
I was never saved.
Always been this position of some of the more evangelical churches. I mean, you see it on the signs outside the churches that become memes, which is like, you know, don't send your kids to university because this you'll lose them from the faith, or you know, education is a real challenge. And you're like, whoa, that's a problem. If you're saying education and learning stuff is a challenge to your faith, and your faith has got some serious issues.
And this ties into what we were talking about in the beginning with not believing in the Old Testament, because there it is right there. You're forced with where we are today in the world with knowledge and how advanced we are and how much we know about the world, how much we know about humans and psychology. You are now forced into a corner to say that it's all a lie. Satan's behind it. Academia just hates the Bible and they're all against us. And you have to be like that, or you have to go into this sort of liberal mode where it's like, well, you know, it's just a religion. It just makes me feel better.
Yeah,
it's either one or the other.
Yeah, and yes. So, and I would say that the weak link to Christian belief really is the Hebrew Bible, is the Old Testament. And I think if your job was to deconvert Christians, I mean, they say this, you know, best way to become an atheist is to read the Bible. But if you were to be really strategic about deconverting someone, I would start with the Old Testament every time a coconut. You know, you start with the Old Testament. It's the weakest link, and watching people try to justify genocide and rape and historically defend the Exodus, I mean, you're onto a loser. So, you know, and let's have a look at the flood. So the flood's an interesting example. People think this is a great story, or you know, children can retell you this story. How wonderful the animals are going to go on the ark 2 by 2, hurrah, hurrah, and they sing songs and they see cartoons and read books. But first of all, it's a pretty morally abhorrent story. And it also disproves God's omniscience. And this is where a bit of philosophy involved here. So like if I read a little bit from Genesis, so bear with me 2 ticks here. So Genesis says, then the Lord saw that the wickedness of mankind was great on earth, and that every intent of the thoughts of their hearts was only evil continually. So that's really interesting. Genesis 6:5 there. Then the Lord saw the wickedness. He didn't know it already. It was like a realization. So the Lord was sorry that he had made mankind on the earth, and he was grieved in his heart. Then the Lord said, I will wipe out mankind, whom I have created from the face of the land, mankind and animals as well, and crawling things and the birds of the sky. For I am sorry that I made them. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. This is a really interesting situation, because you have an omniscient God who supposedly has divine foreknowledge of all future events, creating humanity, and then realizing that they were a bit crap and he had made a really rubbish creation, that he had to like wipe the slate clean. Literally, he's like got this table where he's making stuff. He just wipes it all clean, throws everything on the table.
After saying, sorry to cut you off. People hate when I do that. I see it in the comments. I got to stop doing that. Anyways, but this is important, because after he says, Then God created man and saw that it was good. It says it right in Genesis 1:2 or whatever it is. I don't know, 1:7.
Great point.
But that's like, why would it say that? Why would it say, then he created man and saw that it was good?
Because for us, because it's a mythological text, and that's a sort of anthropomorphic God you are going to be writing, because you're just writing myth, right? Or you're writing a creation story.
Right. But I didn't mean to throw you off, though.
But no, it's a really good point, because it might be true that God created the earth or everything, or didn't. But it might be true that God did. But in your writing of that story, you are not writing it accurately. You are just writing a human understood story for your human audience. So you have a God realizing that, oh, what I've created is good, and then it goes on a little bit, and then realizing, oh no, they're not, they're really bad, and destroying them all, literally killing every human being, unborn fetuses, children, killing them bar 8, and killing every animal. What have all the animals done? But killing out all the animals and then starting again. And he realizes then that he didn't have this knowledge, omniscience, this divine foreknowledge to go, I know that at this point,
if I do this, this will happen.
This will happen. They will be bad. So I'm not going to do that, because then I'll just have to start again. So what's the point of doing all that? But he does it anyway. So the whole story invalidates God's foreknowledge, right? Divine foreknowledge. So it's a problem before we even begin really looking at it. But then you've got just a shed load of problems, right? You've got this idea that obviously, like I've talked, it's not particularly pro-life. You hear these pro-life Christians, God's killing children, fetuses, humans, animals, just left, right, and center. It's a reworking of Tablet 11 of the Epic of Gilgamesh. So go and read that. There's verbatim verses just taken out of that and thrown into Genesis.
Literally, yeah.
You've got doves and raven, right? The raven in the Genesis account makes no sense at all. It's there because it was in the Epic of Gilgamesh, right. and you've got the same. It's just so obviously misappropriating previously existing texts and sources from elsewhere. You've got the same stuff happening. You got them alighting from the boat and burning burnt offerings as sacrifices to the god in the same way. It's just the same thing. It's the same story, although changed in meaningful ways for the particular audience. So instead of for the Atrahasis and then the Epic of Gilgamesh, so you got two myths that pre-exist the Hebrew Bible version. The gods are killing humans because they're just too noisy. It's a bit like, they're annoying me, let's get rid of them. Whereas for the Yahweh,
that's what he says.
Yeah, but for the Yahweh God, it's
their fault.
The meaning, it's how you change. We talked about this before. When you're making allusions to other texts or sources, the meaning for your audience comes from the changes you make to it.
Right.
Okay. So it's like they'll go, oh, I know this. I know this. I know this from there. I know this from there. I know this from so the bit that you change is what lodges in your audience's minds and creates more of a meaning. So here it's like, gods aren't killing, or God isn't, A, it's not gods, it's God, and B, they're killing humans for the wickedness of humanity. And so we start introducing some really important theology into this story. But it's still just using a previous mythological framework. This deluge that supposedly killed everyone, I mean, we still got consistent writing and artifacts from before, during, and after any flood. There's no gaps. There's just, we have extant artifacts to show that there wasn't a gap of however long it takes for human society to start again. There's internal contradictions in the Bible where you've got 40 days or 150 days, you've got 2 of each animal or 7 of each animal, and that's because there are different accounts spliced together. This is called the documentary or supplementary hypothesis, depending on which one you adhere to, but different multiple source theories. So the Bible is not made up of one source. There's sometimes 4 accounts of the same story interwoven with each other, which is why you get repetition, and not repetition for any good reason, just useless repetition. It's called redundancy. So you get repetition and redundancy, and this happens in the flood account, which leads you to believe that you know, that A, there's contradictions, and B, they're coming from multiple sources and being spliced together. So how does that play with literal history? You've got 8 people looking after the world's biggest zoo. I mean, I don't know if you've watched like reality TV shows of zoos being, you know, I watch them with my kids sometimes, and you got like
Can you
hundreds.
imagine all the piss and shit on the boat? Where do they do with all that? Who fed them all? Where was the food coming from?
That's one of my later arguments,
What's
which
a
is like,
carnivore?
yeah, all the feces, the ventilation. Didn't seem to be any windows on board. How, you know, the light, the carnivores. These animals are going to need huge amounts of other animals. It's not 2 by 2, you know, they're not coming in 2. We're going to need like 50 gazelle for these, like
For
lions
40
and
days,
tigers.
no, was it a year, right? It's 365 days. For a whole year, you have a tiger sitting next to a cantaloupe for a whole year that doesn't eat it.
There you go. So you've got a huge problem with that, but then you've got yeah.
I was going to say this. Okay. So I've brought this up to somebody before, another Christian. I said exactly what we just said. And I go, how do you explain that? But he goes, well, this is God doing this, so it's obviously going to be a miracle. I go, hold on a second, though. So if he's going to do all this through a miracle, if this isn't done, if you can't scientifically explain this, you can only say it's a miracle, then why didn't he just snap his fingers and everyone was dead? Why did you have to put him on a boat to begin with?
Yeah.
So there has to be an explanation for this.
This is the tension. It's a great point.
The fact that Noah has to go on a boat means he had to do it. So you can't say it's a miracle, because if it's a miracle, he could have just snapped his fingers and then everyone's dead and the world starts over. Yeah. Problem solved. Miracle.
And you don't have to go through the pain of people actually drowning. You know, just they don't exist.
Yeah, they're just gone. You just start over.
It's a really good point. And you get this tension with people trying to prove things like the flood naturalistically and going to all these lengths. But then if you believe that God is omnipotent, then God can just do everything by miracle. But then you get this situation like, if God has done it by miracle, he appears to have swept all the evidence away from it by miracle afterwards. It's like, here's a miracle, it's happened. Like, you can't use natural science to explain this. Look, blah. But also,
it just happened. Yeah,
sweeping it up afterwards. Just
right. And then making it look like geological rock layers are still there.
Yeah.
Making it look like the world is old and it's billions of years old. Making it look like that there's plate tectonics, and it's all just, there's no big
it's like sweeping it away and placing some counter evidence.
Right.
So this looks like it never, to us, like using the scientific method, it looks like it never happened. It's theologically nonsense. It's philosophically nonsense. We've got no evidence for it happening, and we've got a load of evidence against it happening. So what you have to say is no evidence for it happening. Well, it happened by supernatural. It was a supernatural miracle, and evidence against it happening. Well, God placed that there for some reason to fool us. Well, no, Satan placed it there. It's like, yeah, but God, as we talked about before, that's doing God's duty.
And then you get into the whole thing. It's like, okay, all these miracles that claim to have happened in the Old Testament days, why did they just stop all of a sudden?
Yeah.
How come in the era of written records, they just stopped? All these common miracles that are happening left and right.
There's a great song by a band called Cursive who did an album called Happy Hollow, which is it's basically an atheist album. And one of their songs is called Retreat. And it's about how God's been on holiday for 2,000 years. It's just brilliant. While you've been on holiday, we've been having all these wars over you and stuff like that. It's just a great song. But I always love the kind of analogy that God's just been on holiday for 2,000 years and pulled out the phone and it's like not answering the phone. It's just like
great. It's just so in your face that it's like, I don't know.
Yeah. So you get 8 people looking after the world's biggest zoo. You've got Noah after the end of the flood living for another 350 years. So by the time he dies, he's 950. I mean,
where's he in the written records? Nowhere.
Do you believe that? Really, honestly? The ark is physically bigger than any wooden vessel can possibly be, arguably by 50%. Clearly, gathering all the animals is impossible. You've got, back to what you were saying, not only... You got to get all these animals. You got worms, sloths, penguins, polar bears, glowworms, koalas, snails. But then you've got things like venereal diseases, pubic lice. You know, Non-Stamp Collector did a fantastic video on Noah's Ark. I suggest any viewer just goes and watches that. It's hilarious. But about, you know, the ridiculousness of actually getting all living things together on the Ark is just so problematic, including like All right, which of us 8 is getting the who's offering to have the pubic lice here? It's like,
right. And what about all the
me?
insects? The millions of species of insects that exist.
Yeah,
Where were
yeah.
they? Were they all on the boat too?
Yeah.
And then it's like, why does God create insects? What are their purpose for? Like, what are they doing? Or if
Yeah.
not for an evolutionary reason, why? Why is that all there? It's like,
But
why is there life in the bottom of the Mariana Trench that just sits there and floats around all day with no purpose? Because if we're it, right? Humans are the only this world was created for humans, right? That's what the Bible says. Then why is there life in the bottom of the Mariana Trench that we have nothing to do with?
yeah, and this is where you get into the argument of carnivorousness or a fawn dying in a forest fire. You know, what's the point of that happening if of all pain and suffering is something to humanity?
Right.
So that's what we talked a little bit about that before. But yeah. So the ark has to be, even with all the animals in the world, the ark has to be bigger than the ark was supposedly, as according to Genesis, supposedly was. And yet we also then need all the food for those animals and all the water for the fresh water for those animals. And so the ark would have been phenomenally huge. And
I guess all those carnivores decided to eat plants for that year.
Yeah,
I mean, that's the only thing you could say. It's the only thing you could say.
Who harvested all those plants?
God made them full the whole time, and they were peaceful because he put a
Perpetual-
spell on them. Well, it's like, why stop there? Why even if he can do whatever you want? What, you know what I'm saying? We already went over that, but you know what
definitely.
I mean.
No, it's a great. It's how God got. The Exodus, humans wandering around Kadesh Barnea in the desert for 40 years. Oh, that's all right. They had manna. Well, fair enough. You know what's
here? I'll give you manna. Well, if you can do that, then what are we doing then?
What's the point of all this rubbish?
What is the point? God. Right? It just doesn't have any sense.
In narrative terms, it's a Deus ex machina. Like it's what an author puts in to get you out of a bit of a bind. Right, it's like, we're going to 40 is a really symbolic year. I mean, the reality was 40 is a symbolic year. They wouldn't have been wandering around for 40 years, but they chose that because 40 is a really important number. So wandering around the desert 40 years, how am I going to get them fed because they're in a desert? Oh, God gives them manna. Yeah, brilliant. I love that. Thanks. Job done. So it's a narrative mechanism. But so going back to Noah's flood, the rainfall. Well, the population first of all. So 8 people. Becoming 7.5 billion people now. It's just that doesn't, from the 8 people onwards, there's just not the time span available given the biblical kind of time span that's accepted as to when the flood happened. You can't go from 8 to where we are now, not realistically. Rainfall would have been 6 inches per minute. Now category 5 hurricane gives you 6 inches per hour, but then that wouldn't last for 40 days either. So 6 inches per minute compared to 6 inches per hour is phenomenal, right? But then that's happening over either 40 days or 150 days. I mean, you've got just imagine the amount of water. If it goes up to the top mountains of the world, we're just talking about Mount Everest. But even if you're talking about Ararat, right? And you're not really somewhere between being literally true and mythology, there's exaggeration. Maybe it's the top of Ararat and not Everest. Okay, but still that amount of water, the weight of that water would crush the Earth's crust. There's not enough water on Earth. There's not enough water molecules for the story to happen in any way naturalistically. And B, if you really did have that amount of water, it would have crushed the Earth's crust and you'd have boiling seas and lava and all sorts of stuff. It's just nuts. The weight of the water is a real problem.
The climate science that goes into this is so insane. Like what it would do to the world if there was a flood that literally covered all the land. The remnants that it would leave, the evidence that it would leave would be so tremendous. Exactly. That it would be it's mind-blowing that people even still debate this.
There's not only is there not evidence for it, but there's evidence against it. So all the fact that the Earth is like it is and doesn't show evidence for it is actually evidence against it, because the Earth would look completely different had we had a flood like that.
Then you got the frozen poles, right? The North. Did he freeze those back up afterwards? And
it's just like again, it's sweeping
So
it
there's
back
so
away
many
to make the
questions.
Earth look like exactly like it did beforehand. Then you've got things like reefs. We've got reefs that we know have been alive for 100,000 years untouched, and they have to have very specific conditions. And they've lasted, although they've been sort of ice ages and this and that, in those particular areas in the world, we've had reefs that have remained untouched in that way, with that amount of water above them for 100,000 years, right? If the global flood had happened, they would have had another 5,000 odd feet of water plus, and those reefs would have been destroyed. They would have been crushed. They wouldn't have existed. They wouldn't now be existing in the way that they do, which is the way they exist now, is showing that they've existed like that because we can date them and we can do all this funky stuff to show that they've been that way for 100,000 years. Would not be the case with the global flood. We've got loads of fossil evidence, radiometric isotope evidence to suggest that the flood didn't happen. It's just absolute nonsense.
Now here's where back to William Lane Craig again, because there are a lot of evidence for single floods happening. The Black Sea region had a flood. Nile River had a flood. Mesopotamia had a flood. India
Have
they
floods.
all
It's not just had a flood. They are continually flooding.
Right.
Continually, but
So
they have.
It's not that crazy. And this is what William Lane Craig would say. Since all these cultures can share this story, this is why this was divinely inspired and told us this way. It's like, wait a minute.
It goes back to what I said earlier.
The whole purpose of the story of mankind being wiped out for their sins.
Humans tend to live by rivers because of fresh water, food, and fertile land, because they are floodplains. But when a river floods, it floods its banks and it spreads silt onto the floodplains, which is really fertile, which then means that you can grow crops particularly well there. So that river's flood often means that you will often get humans coming into contact with floods all over the world. It's just how it's going to happen. So every culture will have some kind of understanding of how floods fit into their own culture, into their own kind of mythology, and they will have their own etiology, their own etiological explanatory stories that will explain why floods take place, given that they don't really understand how floods take place.
Right.
I've had arguments with Christian apologists online. I've had extensive written debates with one particular one called Dave Armstrong, a Catholic apologist, who argues for a localized flood. It's like, dude, how do you get a localized flood, right? Do you not know that water finds its own level and it will go to the lowest place? So if you have the Ararat Mountains, in the mountains in the region, which then go down to the Red Sea and down to the desert, in order to keep that at the level of the top of Mount Ararat, or even this guy was arguing, it was a mistranslation and it only means the top of the hills. Well, if it's to the top of the hills, not all of the world will be wiped out, and people just run up the mountains, and so would the animals. It's just like, stop it.
And then you start going into it's a mistranslation, and then it's like, well, then how strong is God's word then?
Yeah,
if there's all these mistranslations. Then it's like the whole thing just falls apart.
Yeah,
this is why the whole point of this whole entire video is to say that the fundamentalists are right here. They are correct.
Yeah.
Saying you have to believe it all is true. Yeah. Or if you don't, you're wrong. It makes the whole thing fall apart. It has to all be true.
Yeah. So just the last bit on the localized flood, imagine having like a square dish, right? A lasagna dish, rectangular lasagna dish, right? And then two of the sides missing. So you just got an L shape. And then trying to pour water in and keep the water up to the level of the top of the dish, but you got two of the sides missing. You can't. It runs away. It just goes to the lowest point, right?
The lowest point, right?
If you are arguing that there's this localized flood where this thing,
and they thought the world was flat back then.
Yeah, takes all this time for it to subside, and then the top of Ararat to be found, and then the boat to rest, and then this and that, and then the dove goes out and all that. If you've got two sides of your lasagna dish missing, that ain't going to be happening, mate. It's just going to be flooding straight to the sea. So get over it. So local floods doesn't work. Global flood doesn't work. The flood story is a myth. It's obviously a myth. To you and I, it's obviously a myth. I mean, there are other reasons, more arguments I could give you, like all the fish would die in the oceans because of the influx of the fresh water. It's just There's no evidence of that, etc., etc. It didn't happen. All right. And then you get to things like the Tower of Babel, right? They're building up a building up to the heavens, and God comes down and says, oh, this is not on. You're using teamwork. Don't like this.
And by the way, before you even say that, right off the bat, if you're a historian that knows anything, or an anthropologist or a linguist, and you hear back when the whole world spoke one language, right away you're like, what? When did that happen? That never happened.
So the Tower of Babel story is completely refuted by how we understand language.
Right.
Just the evolution of language.
Right before you even tell the story, when you say, well, back when the whole world spoke one language, done. Start over.
And we've used greater teamwork since then for great ends, but also nefarious ends. We've built much higher buildings. We've got skyscrapers now that are just phenomenally higher. So the whole Tower of Babel story never happened, and God, again, it's refuted by the idea of God's omniscience. Like, if he had divine foreknowledge, he's not going to suddenly realize, oh, hang on, what's going on here? And in the story, it literally has God coming down and going, oh, what are you doing here, boys?
Shit, I left you guys for a couple minutes. Now look what you're doing.
Gee, I'm just making a cup of tea, and it turns out you've built some, actually, relatively speaking, in terms of what the history of what will come, a really small building. Right. And I'm so annoyed that you built a small building. I'm going to scatter you all around the world and give you all different languages so you can't get on with each other.
And yeah, you're all just going to learn languages instantly that you never heard of before.
Yes. And so this is obviously another example of etiology, of explaining how languages came about and why different regions of people would speak different languages. Because actually, if you think about it, imagine you're a person like 5,000 years ago, and you're speaking your language, and you got someone over there speaking a completely different language, and you've got your understanding of how the world came to be, right? And the fact that my gods are surely everyone's gods, or there's my divine council. There's a divine council that rules over the whole world, not just this area. You're either wrong, or your gods are part of the divine council, or whatever. So, however I understand the world, why the heck do we all speak different? Why do you guys speak a different language? Why do you guys speak a different language? I can imagine that being a difficult, kind of a weird thing to think about. I mean, we take it for granted. But actually, for someone trying to understand how that might work with their own creation mythology and their own idea of their own history, that might be quite a problem. So then you would say, right, well, how do we understand this in terms of God, our God, or our gods? Well, here's a story that explains how people speak loads of different languages. Bosh,
that's a really good point. Yeah, that's exactly what that's exactly what happened. People were trying to, why do people speak different languages? And it also fixes a problem before it occurs. The problem of the genealogies of everyone going back to the same Adam and Eve. If everyone speaks a different language, it shows that people have different genealogies. They came from different parts of the world. There's different races of people. Well, now you can fix that with they were all together. They were all from one spot, but God's the one that made them all change their languages,
scattered them, and then job done.
And this is important because the New Testament, like it always does, the New Testament takes everything out of the Old Testament and sort of reassembles it and changes it up a little bit, polemics it, you know what I'm saying? And they address this in Acts when everyone's speaking different languages, but they can understand each other. This is sort of a polemic at the Tower of Babel, where these are all saved. They all can understand each other through the Holy Spirit, even though they speak different languages.
There's so much intertextuality between. I mean, we talk about intertextuality, so the reliance of one text on another text from another culture, in terms of, say, the Hebrew Bible and the ancient Near East. Okay, so you can look at the Exodus, you can look at the covenant code, the legal code within the Hebrew Bible. So there are different legal codes within the Hebrew Bible, but covenant code is one of them, and you can see it's broadly drawing from the Code of Hammurabi, but also the Hittite laws and these other law codes that existed around here. And that's intertextuality, where you're saying, well, okay, how does this text rely on this one? How does the allusion get made? And again, the meanings are in the differences rather than the similarities, and all this kind of stuff. But sometimes we forget the intertextuality between the Old Testament and the New Testament, the Hebrew Bible and the
Absolutely.
New Testament. And that's going on there as well. It's like an
A lot.
internal thing. And even from within the Hebrew Bible to other points within the Hebrew Bible, there's all this intertextuality and reference and allusion to other stories to make this story. You get this thing called pesha, which is like a way of reinterpreting, a rabbinic way of reinterpreting old stories into a way that's more useful for the current audience, making them more current. But the New Testament does that arguably with making Jesus the new Moses,
New Joseph.
Yep, you've got
They make him a new Adam. They make him a new Moses. They make him a new Joseph. They make him a new Abraham too. They're basically saying all these characters from the Old Testament. We have all of those rolled into one. It's Jesus.
Yeah. And it's got to be, because he's got to be better than all those people. Because if you're a Christian and you are trying to convert a Jew, you have to say, and Jews have got all their number one awesome dudes, right? I've got this array of people. I've got the patriarchs, and I've got these important people. Yeah, but my guy's better than all of them. What, all of them? Yeah, literally, he's a new Adam, he's a new Moses, he's a new Joseph, a new Abraham, and this is how. And this story is an element of that, and this transfiguration is an element of, up Mount Ararat, Mount Horeb or Sinai. We're gonna take all these ideas and we're going to put them into Jesus, and Jesus becomes a really interesting example of intertextuality.
And this is the answer to the question we had at the beginning: is, do you need the Old Testament for Christianity to be true? Does the Old Testament have to be true? And the answer is yes, because that's how they make Jesus to begin with. He is the response to everything of the Old Testament. The New Testament's drawing from the Old Testament, but for it to be true, you have to look at it the opposite way. You have to look at it as the Old Testament is prophesizing the New Testament. You can't, if you say it's drawing from the Old Testament, then it's false. But if you're saying that the Old Testament is prophesizing the New Testament, now it's true. So therefore, you can't just have a New Testament by itself. They have to be together. So both have to be true.
You have lots of really interesting questions. So this is what I'm trying to work out now. So if I was a Christian, right, and I came to conclusion, let's take this a reductio ad absurdum. So let's take it to the absurd level. Well, I'm a Christian, and I now believe that the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, was entirely false. It's just basically, it's all historically wrong, or it's impossible for me to knowingly, really accurately pick out what's correct in there. So if it's all wrong, for the sake of argument, how could I justify my religion? So I can maybe say that okay, Jesus isn't the new Moses because Moses didn't exist, but whoever you thought Moses was, and the great aspects of Moses' character and his mythos, or is whatever you think he is, Jesus is that. Yeah, okay, maybe. And as you say, then it's almost like just starting again. This is a whole new thing. But then Yahweh isn't the God. Yahweh didn't appear to Moses. Yahweh didn't give these legal codes. These legal codes came from elsewhere. Actually, I don't know. I don't know how I would have to really jump through hoops as a Christian to completely throw out the Old Testament and maintain a Christianity.
Yeah, I mean, because then it's like, how strong does the New Testament even become anymore when you throw out the Old Testament?
Yeah,
what has no more strength anymore? The
all
strength
those
of the New
references.
Testament, the strength of the entire gospel story is that all these Old Testament prophecies are being fulfilled somehow. That's what makes it so powerful. So if you actually take that away and say, well, the Old Testament is probably just myth, it's probably just folk story, Jewish folklore, then it's like, well, then why are you still a Christian? Why even be a Christian? Why not just, why not be a Buddhist? Or what's the difference now? Why don't you just pick Hinduism? Why don't you try something, Zen or something? Like, what's the difference anymore? What even appeals to you to Christianity? And I'm asking this to the liberal Christians.
Yeah.
What is appealing about it? And a lot of times you'll hear, well, I like Jesus' attitude is love your neighbor. And, he was very loving and feed the poor and this, that, and the third. And it's like, well, you're just making your own Christianity right now, which is
because you can have
fine.
all those things. I mean, Confucius came up with the golden rule 500 years before Christianity, before Jesus. Right? So you can have these moral rules without Jesus. You don't have to have faith in Jesus. So then all it becomes is like, well, then it becomes about the sacrifice of Jesus must have meaning. This is a whole resurrection. But then if we say, well, the resurrection, you're irrational to believe that the resurrection historically happened. I mean, that's what I'm trying to say in that book there, which is you aren't justified in believing that happened. I don't know. You just get left. Well, this is why I'm not a Christian. Okay, so right. The Old Testament, there's so much reference to the Old Testament. There's so much reliance on the Old Testament. There's Jesus saying, I'm fulfilling every jot and tittle of the law. So if he's saying that, if you believe as a Christian that Jesus believed in the Hebrew Bible, right, and Jesus is God, and then we're saying that the Hebrew Bible is incorrect, historically speaking, then what's going on there? How can God believe in something that was false or inaccurate? And well, then are you telling me that Jesus didn't believe that then? Or it just gets this confusing hot mess of like, I don't really understand how you can maintain your belief.
And then there's always the Christian that, well, we should just if everyone acted like Jesus, the world would be a better place. And that, what I say to that is, are you sure about that? Because think about it. If everyone acted like Jesus, okay, what does Jesus want you to do? He wants you to worship him. He wants you to drop what you're doing and follow him. He wants you to let the dead bury the dead. Who cares about that? He wants you to throw everything away and forget about tomorrow. Who cares about climate change? Who cares about working? Who cares about building society? Stop what you're doing and work and just worship, and that's it.
But he also
the world
said,
would not be a better place.
He also said, sell all your stuff and do it. There's a great book by David Madison called, 10 Things Christians Wish Jesus Hadn't Taught and Other Reasons to Question His Words. So he goes through 10 really problematic things that Jesus actually taught, that Christians generally gloss over or find a bit uncomfortable, but then try and spin it in a way that's not so uncomfortable for them. So people who believe in the prosperity gospel should have real issues with Jesus saying, go and sell everything type thing. There's a bunch of quotes where he's like, get rid of all your possessions and all this, the opposite to what the prosperity gospel would be saying. And
right. It's easier for a camel to go through a hole of a needle than it is for a rich person to go to heaven, he says.
Yeah, all those kind of things. And then stuff to do with you should hate your family and give up your family before coming to me type thing. All these you can go and find a quote.
If you even think about what is it, lust, then if you even think about a person that way, you've already lusted. It's like now you're going beyond what Moses said. Moses said just don't do it. But Jesus says if you think about it, he's not that lovey-dovey.
No, there are a bunch of things that Jesus said that don't fit into that really nice liberal understanding of Jesus, or even like versions of Jesus that other evangelicals will have. You have to kind of cherry pick your Jesus quotes in order to get the Jesus that you want, and I think that's pretty problematic. I think
he's schizophrenic. He really is. He was because he's in one moment he's cursing fig trees, and the next minute he's helping a lady who's about to get stoned to death. It's like what is he trying to do? You can't figure the person out. So that's what I'm saying. The people who say if everyone just follow it, what would Jesus do? Get your little bracelet. If everyone acted like Jesus, the world would be a better place. It's like, no, everyone would be schizophrenic. Everyone would think that they're the Son of God. Everyone would think, stop what you're doing, follow me. My word, I'm going to curse a fig tree. And the whole world would act like that. The whole world would be screwed.
So, I mean, going back to the original point, you start taking Jesus out of the Jewish Hebrew Bible context, and you are left with a really empty Jesus culturally and certainly historically. When you make these claims, it's like Raymond Brown. I often say this. Raymond Brown, the great Catholic exegete who wrote The Birth of the Messiah and The Death of the Messiah, 2-volume work, The Death of the Messiah. Birth of the Messiah, both absolute magisterial works. But and he's really critical of the history of Matthew and Luke in the birth narratives, and also a lot of the historical claims within the resurrection narratives. He's very nuanced, and I'd say, look, if you're saying that there's no history, say, in the birth narratives, but there's some kind of theological verisimilitude, what are you hanging that theology on? If you're saying, yeah, okay, maybe historically these things didn't happen, but they still, through dramatization and this and that, they speak of a theological truth. I don't get that. I don't get what the theological truth can be. So if you're saying Jesus came out of Egypt, like Matthew says, Gospel of Matthew, came out of Egypt, because out of Egypt I will call my son Israel. Right. So this is a fulfillment of prophecy, and here this is showing that Jesus is the Messiah. But if you're then saying either that didn't happen, Jesus never went to Egypt and never came out of Egypt, because it didn't happen in Luke. So you're saying either that didn't happen, or you're saying none of the original Old Testament stuff happened, so that coming out of Egypt is kind of meaningless anyway, because it's referring to a prophecy that never happened in the first place.
Right.
Then what are you actually trying to say with your theology that you are still trying to claim is true? How can Jesus be the Messiah? What does it mean to be the Messiah outside of the stuff that you've just thrown away?
It's like, it's so funny that you said that, because that's the whole point, is that you're working within the realm of Judaism to begin with. Christianity is basically a response to Judaism.
It's a form of Judaism.
Yeah,
initially,
you can't have a Messiah without the Old Testament. It's like, what is it? It's like, what if I make up a word, Xenophon, like, or Zanhun, right? The Zanhun is coming. You'd be like, huh? Who's the Zanhun? That word comes from somewhere. It comes from the Old Testament. So you can't cut out the Old Testament and say, do you get what I'm saying? Like,
you can't decontextualize something and have it still make that much sense.
Right. The vocabulary itself comes from that Old Testament. So if the Old Testament's not true, the New Testament's false too, period. And that's the answer to the whole question.
Or it's really empty and very brittle. Yeah, so I don't know. And maybe you will have some viewers. I know that the last video we did has attracted a load of Christian commenters on it. Like, I'd be interested in how, if there are Christians out there, because the reason I got into this question is because I was posting sometime back about how the flood didn't happen, about, in the ways I've been arguing earlier, and about how this didn't happen, that didn't happen. And a couple of friends of mine on Facebook who are Christians are saying, oh, you're attacking low-hanging fruit, right? You're attacking low-hanging fruit. It's obviously literary, the Old Testament, and it's clearly, not historical. And it's a beautiful book, but it's, all beautiful stories and whatever. I was like, hang on, whoa. Right. There are shed loads of people that do believe these to be historically true. And B, how do you justify your Christianity by simply brushing away these uncomfortable historical inaccuracies and morally problematic stories from the Old Testament and saying, yeah, but I'm still a Christian, and I'm, you're just attacking that stuff is really cheap. You want to be concentrating on this stuff. It's like, no, I don't accept that. I want to know how you can be a justified Christian and let go of all the Old Testament. And they never really answered that adequately.
And that's what I want to look forward to seeing in the comments, hopefully. Even if you're not a Christian, if you can brainstorm a reason for Christianity to be plausible that the Old Testament's false, then write it in the comments. I want to hear I want to see these responses.
Yeah. So I think it's a really interesting question, and that is one that is where I think in my own personal writing journey, in the trilogy of the Nativity, of the Resurrection, and of the Exodus, if you take all of those out, how can you justify being a Christian? Because the Exodus particularly is a hugely important part, because it gets referred to an awful lot in the New Testament, Moses and the whole Exodus story, and the bondage. You get a lot of theologians talking about, the slavery bondage of under Pharaoh,
of the law, and in the epistles, in Paul's epistles, he basically uses that mythos of the leaving Egypt as for the Jew to leave the law and come to freedom, which is Christ.
Yeah.
So there you like they play that off. They play those things.
And a lot of biblical exegetes or Hebrew Bible experts, particularly Hebrew Bible exegetes, will say the whole point of the Hebrew Bible is the delivery of the law. It's actually the legal code that comes after Exodus. So it's like the creation, yeah, you take it or leave it, but it's all these myths are leading up to the Exodus story. But the Exodus story itself isn't important in and of itself, but it's all about building up to the delivery of the moral law. And then the delivery of the moral law is the core component of the Hebrew Bible.
Which, by the way, and this can be a whole nother subject, is that is also why the Christians, when they made the order of the canon, they had to move around books. Like, for example, Ezra and Nehemiah, I'm trying to pronounce the name right. Those are the last two prophets to come before that's like after Daniel. Those are like the last two. And in the Christian Bibles, pick any Christian Bible, King James, NIV, whatever you want. They put those in the beginning. Ezra, Nehemiah, and then Malachi is the last one because Malachi talks about a need for a Messiah. So if you look at the Hebrew Old Testament, they have the books in order chronologically. They have Ezra and Nehemiah first, or is it Ezra and Nehemiah.
So you're saying the Christian Bible
have Malachi. They have like in the correct order the Torah. Obviously, the Christian Bible has the Torah first because you can't split that up because there was once upon a time it was only those 5 books.
Yeah,
everything else was separate. It was all scrolls. Anyways, long story short, the Hebrew Tanakh has a different order because it's in chronological order. The Christians had to rearrange that order to make it a story for a Messiah.
Yeah, and so what you're effectively saying is that prologue is itself problematic. And if you're saying that all these law, I mean, the Christians, I suppose Christians could take it either way because they're saying if the Hebrew Bible really is about the laws, the covenants, and the codes that come in it, then for the Christian, it's saying, well, actually, there's a new covenant here, there's a new legal agreement, and there's a new testament, and there's a new bunch of laws, and those old ones are superseded by Jesus and the new ones. Which is kind of bizarre if you're saying, well, actually, the old ones weren't really, they weren't delivered by God. They were just, nicked from a bunch of other cultures and developed by people themselves. Can you still get a coherent Christianity even given that? I don't know.
Which is exactly why they had to rearrange the books to make it coherent. Yeah. Otherwise, it's like if you end on Ezra and Nehemiah are talking about the need for the law. If you end on Malachi, which is what the Christian Bible does, Malachi talks about the need for a Messiah. It has to end on a need for a Messiah because what's next? Book of Matthew. Here's a Messiah. If it ended on the need for the law, it's like, well, why are we going from the need to the law to here's a Messiah? So anyways, that's a hugely interesting point there. Yeah. Yeah. And this has been great. Everybody go to A Tippling Philosopher.
Yes, please do.
Type that right in and it'll come right up. Subscribe. And there's tons of videos. How many videos you got? You have like 100.
Loads more, yeah. And I'm pumping out quite a few at the moment. I've got hold of permission to post some of my older presentations. So I've just put up one on the Nativity and one on the Resurrection, the presentations that I've given public talks. So check them out. They're doing pretty well at the moment. They basically condensed my books into like an hour and a half. So,
there you go. It's a lot of information too.
Definitely buy my books anyway.
Yeah. Check them out on Amazon. And that is it. And you have just attained true gnosis.
You have just attained true gnosis. The demiurge has no power over you.